Now that you've sold the rebrand, you've got sign off, you've got the budget to work with, and it's on you to make it happen. Where do you get started? MC.
G'day, Dave.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. Yeah, really good.
It's good.
So when you rebrand, does it mean that you've got to change everything from the get-go?
Well, probably. No, not necessarily. I mean, we've been involved in rebrands ourselves where we didn't change everything. So I think certainly in terms of trying to figure out where you start and what will need to change and what almost that brief looks like that you're pulling together and a list of checkpoints. The first place to start really is, what am I trying to achieve or what am I trying to fix? You know, we talked a lot in the first episode of this series about signs that it's ready for a rebrand, and a lot of those were sort of problems that you might identify. And I guess to link that through to this topic, you know, if you think about, say, if one of the things that you were trying to fix is that my brand no longer tells the right story. Okay, well, maybe your logo doesn't have to change if your brand story is the thing that's not coming through. That might be more in the messaging that needs updating, or the website needs to change. But, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change everything. Another example might be if one of the things you've identified that's wrong is that you're trying to be premium, but, you know, your visuals aren't premium. Well, maybe then you just need to change the visuals, but maybe your messaging is fine, you know. So I think the first place to start is to really think about, again, why you're doing this, and then what are the things that are kind of broken that need fixing to come into alignment with that.
Yeah, because this can be a daunting thing for any brand manager, is like you've been kind of like behind the rebrand efforts, the push to get this thing to happen, and then it's on you to make it happen, and then you start looking across all things that you need to do. And I think the reality of all of the weight of the project that's ahead just becomes a really heavy burden.
Yeah.
So it's like, where do you even start?
Yeah. And there's certainly, you know, cost implications to that, time frame, you know. I think it's important to remember as well that even though we talked about the idea last time of selling the rebrand and assuming that you've got to this point because you have sold it, doesn't mean that all those other concerns and you know, naysayers and other people involved goes away. Like, it's not magically fixed, you know.
Yeah. Just
because you've signed off with the CEO on the concept of, hey, we're going to rebrand, doesn't then mean that they're not going to be with you every step and every decision, you know, including this one of working out, okay, what has to change? They might say, okay, I'm fine to rebrand, but I won't change the logo. And that might present a whole, you know, new set of challenges or things to overcome.
Yeah, I think the thing with the rebrand process is there's some sequencing that has to happen, and I think there's the strategy and the thinking aspect that needs to happen. That's the first kind of cab off the rank, and then it becomes about, okay, the identity and their messaging. So these are kind of like the foundational kind of layers to a rebrand, But then you think about, okay, where do you apply those things to? What are the physical assets? Where does it go in terms of its digital presence?
Yep.
And I think then it becomes more of a bespoke situation. If you're an e-commerce brand, like probably the first place you're gonna go to is your website.
Yep.
Like that's the thing that you're gonna address first and foremost. If you're in retail, like bricks and mortar retail, you're probably gonna think about the store experience. And you probably need to look at like an impact matrix. If you're a brand manager and you're thinking about where you can affect change most rapidly, it's kind of plotting those things on an impact matrix and going, okay, well, yeah, the website is going to be the thing that's going to tick sales along. And unfortunately or fortunately, they're driven mostly by economic decisions. Yeah. And this is where you got to kind of get your numbers brain on as a brand manager and start thinking about like, where do you place your bets, and thinking about it in those terms.
Yeah. And also how much you can bite off at any one point, and what are the things that you can live with too, you know?
Yeah.
You probably want to do it all in the first case, but that's probably not realistic. So as you say, sequencing and thinking about the order of things and which bits you can sort of live with for a little bit. I mean, is it a case as well that, do you see that when you're doing a rebrand, you can maybe break some rules for a little bit? You know, one of the cornerstones of branding that we would always preach is consistency and making sure that everything looks and feels the same, across the whole brand experience all the time. Do you think that you can sort of break that rule for a period while you're rebranding, or do you have to get it all right from the start?
Oh, look, I mean, in perfect agency land, you want everything to be, perfectly consistent.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely that's definitely what we would preach along the way. But yeah, I mean, the practicality of a rollout means that, it's probably going to be a scenario where there are going to be some elements that are going to be inconsistent, but you can live with those because you're focusing on the biggest priorities, early on, and then you're kind of getting to the lowest of those priorities maybe in 12 months' time or 6 months' time, or whatever the timeline looks like.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's fine to be inconsistent as long as there's a good game plan behind trying to patch up those inconsistencies in a short or defined space of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think you're probably starting with a bit of an audit, what are all the things, and, a big list of things that potentially need to change, throw them in a bit of an impact matrix, as you said, what's going to take the most effort, what's going to have the biggest impact, but then think about how you can eventually get to a point where everything, is consistent.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you make about the audit. And hopefully at some point prior to even getting to the sign-off step, you've already done that audit of like everything that you've got to touch, and it's just about trotting that back out again and kind of using that as your laundry list of, and then it's kind of a process of impact and prioritization. But once you've got that done, so once you've kind of figured out how you're going to roll this out and in what order, then becomes the issue of who you're going to work with. So, and typically most companies don't do this in-house. It's you look to the agency to try and help you, roll this whole thing out. Where do you stand on finding the right agency partner? Like, what are the things that you should kind of be, mindful of in that process?
Yeah, I mean, there's some obvious ones off the top that you probably take for granted, but it's important to kind of vet, and they're things like experience. Do they have experience doing the thing that I want them to do?
Yep. History of results. History of return on investment.
Yeah, are they serious and experts in the area? There's a lot of, I guess, what's the word? In agency land, I guess there's a lot of people that look the same or list a lot of services, and I guess digging a little bit below that to uncover whether they actually have a lot of experience or expertise in a particular area is definitely a good place to start. The obvious thing, and why so many agency sites are basically portfolios, is do I like the work that they do? But I think one way to even evaluate that a bit deeper is to look at the types of businesses that they work with. Are they similar to, my situation? It's not that they have to have done, 5 accounting sites before if I'm an accounting firm, but even when you're looking at sort of general industry or size or whatever, I think it's important to try and sort of align yourself with an agency that has done sort of similar situations to yours before, not just nice work, but work that resonates with your particular industry. Personality fit, is another good one. Sort of looking at their style, and hopefully you can glean a bit about their process and communication preferences and all that sort of stuff, and seeing whether that aligns with what you're about. So
yeah, I think that's a big one.
I mean, what about you? Is there other things you look for?
Oh, look, I mean, we recently had to go through the process because we were trying to enlist a development agency to work alongside us in another project. And the first thing that we did was we drew up a really good brief. And that was step number 1. So within that brief, there was things like the backstory behind the project. There was the challenges that we were facing in the project. There was personas. There was this idea of like where we want to head, and then kind of potentially some ideas that had already been floated. It had some values and mission. I think that's important as well. What success looks like, timeline. Those are the kind of the typical mastheads for these types of documents. But the thing is, I think the quality of the brief will directly impact on the quality of the agency and the response from the agency. We've had some pretty weak briefs in our time.
For sure.
And that doesn't necessarily mean we responded weakly, but it just means that you've got to interrogate that brief, and it means you're probably going to have 2 or 3 more phone calls with the company that you're working with to kind of really understand the brief before you can respond to it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I would just say, like, the quality of the brief is really important. And it shows a level of standard that you want to achieve as well too. You're sort of, you're stepping forward on the right foot, as opposed to, kind of putting something together that's a bit half-assed.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great place to start when you're trying to find an agency partner to work with, is a great brief. Mm-hmm. Like you, I mean, on my list I had past experience, I think, is a big factor in all of this. And next to past experience was culture fit. Mm-hmm. The culture fit, I think, is a big one. You're going to be working with that agency for a long period of time, especially in a rebrand situation.
Yeah.
If you don't have the right people on the agency side that you really kind of vibe with, that alone, like, they could do great work, but they're just assholes to deal with.
Yeah.
That can be, a real challenge. Like, that could be kind of like the thing that kind of breaks the project.
Yeah.
So I think culture's a big one.
Do you have any thoughts on the best way to actually evaluate that culture?
Well, I mean, look, I think there's always the exploratory phone call as a starting point. And I would recommend that anyone that's trying to find an agency, like, go ring up 6 agencies, like, do your Google search, go through LinkedIn, like, look for recommendations. And when you've been able to, kind of pull together a short list of, maybe you've got 10 agencies on there, 6 might have, kind of lived up to the standard that you're looking for. Get on the phone and just have that exploratory phone call. You can tell a lot from a phone call.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one, because, I mean, we've seen it ourselves, even in that search you're talking about as well, the difference between even what a glossy website, the impression that might give, and that might give you a good feeling, can be starkly different to, just even that first impression once you get them on the phone or on a video chat.
Yeah.
I think that tells you probably a lot more than, just what's on the website, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I even broke it down a little further in terms of, like, have those 6 phone calls, but then only take 3 forward, because the reality is you want to kind of go a little bit deeper with those 3, and time becomes a factor. So when you get down to 3, jump on a video call with them. I mean, that's a good opportunity for them to be able to give a more kind of formal response or a pitch back, to understand more about their ethos. Mm-hmm. And again, you're probably going to find that there's a lot of similarities between those 3 agencies. If they're a good quality agency, you're going to find that they're going to be hard to separate. Mm-hmm. So how do you separate?
Yeah.
And I think that becomes a question of, like, culture fit. I think that's the big one. And for us, when we were evaluating the development team we were speaking about before, the culture fit was the one that was probably the thing that won it over in the end. There are other ways to kind of evaluate. I mean, you can potentially look on social media, so follow their social for a little bit, see what they're about, try and deduct what you can from that. The other one might be to also have a little look inside the trophy cabinet as well, and see, are there any awards that they've recently won or have won in the past. Awards are a tricky thing as well too, because I think you can game that a little bit.
Yeah.
But if they're an awarded agency, I think that definitely helps sort of build credibility. So you might look for those aspects.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, another one for me on the idea of sort of getting to know what they're really like better is to actually ask for references. Mm-hmm. So again, this is something that we did a bit with our search for an agency.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Because I think, again, you could just go off the testimonials, on a website and think, okay, well, that's the social proof that I need. But again, you can sort of unpick that a lot, just even in a 5-10 minute call with someone who's actually worked with them before, who's maybe a bit more impartial, or that you get a chance to ask your own questions about what you care about. For example, if you care a lot about the process, you can ask a bit more questions about what the process was really like. What are the communications like? How did they handle things when things went wrong? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I totally forgot that one, but that was definitely one of the most helpful parts of the evaluation process when we were going through it, was to actually get a couple of recommendations. I mean, I always wonder about that, because it's a bit like the job reference as well too. You're like, why would anyone put a bad reference in there? But I think most people are pretty honest about those things, and you can like learn a lot about a company just by having those discussions, with that reference. So, yeah, I think that's a good one for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the last things that I had really then start to get more into the practicality side of things. So, are they available even? When can they start? Some agencies are booked months in advance. Does that work in with your timeline? How long do they think it's going to take? Again, does that match up with your expectations? And I think the flip side of that is also just being prepared to be a bit flexible, that you might have to change some of your expectations, so, is it worth it to you to work with a particular agency if it does mean that you have to put things off for a month, and certainly I would encourage people to think longer term around those things. I mean, we encounter it a bit that oftentimes someone set an arbitrary deadline of, we need this done by, by the end of January. Like, why? Well, no real reason. It just sounds good, So,
yeah,
I guess just being open to some sort of level of flexibility as to whether the agency fits in with your plans or not.
I think that's a big one for sure. Yeah, arbitrary deadlines.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I guess just on the timing aspect of it as well, is that can be a bit of a double-edged sword with the busyness of an agency. You want an agency to be busy because they're in demand, but also on the flip side, if they're so busy that they're not going to be able to service the project effectively, that's a little nuance that you've got to look out for as well too, is like to understand just how much work have they got on ahead of them, and whether they're going to be able to dedicate the team.
Yep.
The final one on that for me is also too is the opportunity to meet maybe more of the broader project team, the people that are actually going to be working directly on your project. It's fine to meet the business development person or the founder, but they most likely won't be the person that you'll be dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So can you get to the project manager? Can you speak to the person that's actually going to be doing the design work, for example?
Yep.
Just to get a sense of, does the culture permeate it all the way down to the project team, or is this just a nice bit of spin that was being put on on the presentation? That leaves the issue of cost.
The touchy subject.
It's always a touchy subject, but I mean, you have to obviously allow some budgeting, some sort of cost expectation.
Yep.
How do you kind of think about budgeting and how much you should put aside for a project like this? What's a reasonable amount to pay? Should we even be getting into those discussions about what's reasonable and what's not?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a cop-out, but it's true to say that it's definitely unique, by a situation. Like, there's, a number of factors, obviously, like we talked about off the top, that audit list of things that need to change. Is that a short list or a really long list?
Yes.
Even under your examples, like if it's a simple e-commerce shop that has 3 products and they just really specialize in those things and they mainly just need a website upgrade around that, that's very different to a retail brand that has 100 stores and might be considering an entire facelift, to the store design under a rebrand. So it's trite, but it's true, that it is unique to every scenario. And then I think there is, I guess, some level of what value does it create for your brand, So, for example, there's the classic example around about what does a rebrand mean to someone like a Pepsi, where, you're talking about billions of dollars of sales, around the world, and moving that needle obviously is through a rebrand could be huge in terms of cost outcome. So maybe they're willing to pay a lot more for their brand than, a cafe around the corner, which is likely to only see a small uptick, in terms of total gross sales from a rebrand. So certainly figuring out which can be difficult, the value that it creates for you, and we talked a bit about last episode when we were thinking about sort of trying to sell the costs into your higher ups, the idea of trying to equate it to some sort of successful outcome and how much that's worth. As we acknowledged last week, I guess that can be quite difficult, but it's at least a place to start and think about. I mean, it's interesting. I was reading something today about it in terms of like this awkward dance that always happens where The client says to the agency, well, how much is it going to cost? And the agency says, well, how much have you got to spend? And they're like, well, you tell me how it's going to cost and I'll tell you whether I can afford that or not. And the agency says, well, depending on your budget will depend what services we recommend and that sort of thing. So it's definitely not easy, but I also think that if both sides just give a little and are a bit open and honest, you'll probably start figuring things out pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there could be a much more elegant conversation to be had around investment into projects. And I use the term investment, not budgeting, because I think budgeting is the wrong terminology to use here. You wouldn't be doing this project, a rebrand, unless you looked at it as an investment, something that was actually going to give impact to the economics of your company.
Yeah.
And so I think, we have to have, I don't know, it's like a more of a sophisticated conversation around pricing.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it just comes down to value as well. And this can be the individual brand manager and what they value. And typically the further you go up the experience tree in agency land, the more you're going to pay for an experienced agency. For sure. And also because they have the ability to de-risk the project, say beyond an agency that's got 2 or 3 years worth of experience versus an agency that's got 20 years of experience.
Yeah.
They know the path ahead. They know how to get the job done, and they know the pitfalls. So you're paying relative to that experience.
Yeah. And quality outcomes,
Exactly.
Design is hard to measure sometimes in that sense of quality.
Yeah.
But there is definitely a difference, and it's often the stuff behind the scenes that you can't see around how much thought and research and strategy goes into things. That de-risks, as you say, but also to me leads to high quality. Experience leads to quality, those sorts of things. So
yeah,
there's definitely a factor, even if it's hard to quantify.
Yeah, on my list I had some questions in terms of things that might impact costs. And these could be questions that you're asking yourself internally. For example, what is the brand doing for growth? Like, just answering that question alone. Do we want a 10% growth? Do we want 15%? Where does it sit? What are the goals for the rebrands? Do we want to change the perception of the brand? Because if we do want to change the perception of the brands, then that might be a much more significant effort than just doing a new brand mark, for example. Are we saying relevant stuff to our audience? Is it going to gain new customers or just service existing ones, or stop us from losing market share? Thinking about those types of questions. And I think all of that leads to the one question, which is, what is a new customer worth to us in the business? And we want to get 100, 1,000, 1 million new customers. I think that's then going to drive an economic result. Okay, so we want to do an extra $5 million in revenue in the next financial year. What is a reasonable amount to compensate the agency? Is it 10%? Like, is it a $500,000 rebrand, which will then give us over the next 5 years or 10 years $50 million extra in revenue? Would that be fair? I think it's about kind of judging the value of the project, but trying to relate it back to some numbers rather than just wait for a proposal from an agency. Think about, like, what would you be willing to pay to get that type of result? Because that's probably going to drive a number on a piece of paper. And I think the thing is, even if the initial conversations can be a bit awkward, you're generally probably going to get an idea fairly quickly as to whether you're on the same page or not. Because that's the thing to me, is like, are you in the same ballpark, or are you just worlds apart and there's no result? Because if it is that you've got a budget of $2,000 and their typical project size is $50,000, then there's not going to be any scenario where you can work together, right? But if you're on the same ballpark, maybe there is some things that they recommend that you hadn't thought of before that would, go beyond what you currently think your budget number is, and that could be totally fine. Like, you could work that out, and vice versa. There are definitely scenarios where you may have a capped budget and the agency can come back to you and say, well, you can't have everything that you wanted, but you could have these 3 things. This is how we recommend that you roll it out and stagger it. So there's definitely a zone of compromisation somewhere there in the middle. I think the main thing in the first part is trying to work out
are we even on the same page, you know?
Yeah. And I think not just tying it to an arbitrary number.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
We've got X amount of dollars to spend, but actually tying it to a number that is focused on growth.
Yeah.
Because the growth number will drive, I think, a spend number that makes more sense.
Yeah. I guess, and partly what I'm getting at is there'll also be an upper limit of what someone just physically can spend, and that will bear out too, even in your scenario where it's tied to growth, because it should, you know, be commensurate with that. But it's just kind of trying to figure out, you know, I think a lot of people go into it with the mindset of, but if I tell the agency my budget, they're just going to rip me off, or they're going to pad out their services to meet that number. Well, I'd say with almost like 80% or more accuracy, it's going to be the other way around, that they're going to have to actually skimp on, or, you know, cut back a little bit on what they would normally do to meet your budget, as opposed to thinking they're going to get, you know, some massive payday out of you.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Yeah. What else is on the list? Anything
Yeah,
else?
I mean, I guess the only other thing really that I was thinking about was just like trying to separate your needs and your wants, you know, when you're thinking about it, and especially if you are sort of getting into that scenario where you're kind of having to compromise back and forth with the agency a bit. A lot of times, you know, you can do that audit like we talked about and come up with 100 things, but, you know, are they all really going to make a big impact, or are they just something that you think would be cool, or you'd love to get that thing sorted that's always bugged you, but, you know, it's more of a want than a need? And again, that we've talked about this before, but some of that can come down to phasing too. You can fix some of your wants later, but if your budget only extends to your needs in the first instance, then just focus on them. And I guess it goes hand in hand with that, as well as like, don't just presume that you know the answer. Like, ask the person that you're talking to what would their recommendation be around where to focus and stuff, you know, because I guess they might see things that you should be focusing on first, or instead of, you know, don't always think that you've got the answer, I guess.
Sage advice.
Yep.
All right, we done on money talk?
I think so.
That's enough money talk for one day. All right, that's a good place to wrap up. This is a weekly conversation between two brand blokes. If you want to hit us up with any questions, you can reach us at plied.studio. If you want to learn more about building a brand, you can listen to other episodes at the Layers Podcast, or you can find us also on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. That's it for today, MC.
Lovely.
Awesome.
Thanks, Dave.
See you next week.
Cheers, mate.